a true turning point election in American history.
Aaron Burr, the third vice president.
And a new republic with him at its head.
Both parties ran candidates.
Thomas Jefferson.
They're both lawyers.
Charged and tried for treason. Burr's conspiracy.
Welcome to Unshut Cases. On today's episode of Unshut Cases, I have an incredible guest with us, Bradley Keffer of Keffer Hirschauer out of Indianapolis, Indiana, an awesome multi-practice law firm focused primarily on criminal defense. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us here today on Unshut Cases.
Well, thanks for having me.
And I am Dan Taft, the host of Unshut Cases. Today, we're going to be running a two-parter, which is really cool. I'm very excited to dive into this. This is the United States versus Aaron Burr, the 1807 treason case, which has other facets to it. Brad, I'll kind of let you kick off here because this is certainly an area of expertise for you that you're definitely a history buff. I love discussing this with you before we got on. So why don't you actually give us the lay of the land of kind of what was happening in the United States around this time leading up to the turn of the century into the 19th century, early 1800s here, and all the context of Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, their dynamic, and how this all kind of, got started.
Sure. To go back into the way back machine, we're looking at about 1803 to 1807 is when the context truly arises. We're talking about a young nation. The United States has just recently been formed. We're about 5 million people in terms of total population, and we're controlled by a very small group of very powerful personalities. Some of them you'll remember, like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. Obviously, there was an up-and-comer out of the Northeast by the name of Aaron Burr. And to put it in context, the Louisiana Purchase had just occurred, and the United States bought that central part of the United States for a paltry $15 million, although in their dollars, not so small. But we were in the process of expanding west. And you're talking about a very young nation with a ruling class that had differing views on what the revolution meant. And it was into this dropped Aaron Burr.
Yeah. It's interesting already. And I know I mentioned to you that book, The American Nations. I think it's Colin Woodward, where he talks about some of this stuff and this like early sort of clash of cultures. I think if I remember correctly, the North Virginia kind of DC elite class you're talking about, they were called like the Tidewater sort of culture there. And definitely Thomas Jefferson was part of that. Obviously, some of this dynamic was made famous, made famous recently by the Lin-Manuel Miranda play Hamilton.
Well, the word got around. They said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education. Don't forget from whence you came. And the world's gonna know your name. What's your name, man?
Alexander Hamilton.
Brad, can you kind of just tell us about what that initial dynamic and sort of relationship was between Aaron Burr and Jefferson, how that came up through the years, and just the whole sort of like ramp up into how this happened before the Louisiana Purchase, and kind of how they knew each other, how they were together as politicians, and just kind of let the audience know about all that.
Yeah, well, for context, elections back then for president were vastly different than what we have today. Today, you've got parties running a ticket of both a president and a vice president together and that campaigning together. Back then, that wasn't how it occurred. Back then, when an individual ran for president, the person who won became the president and the runner-up became the vice president. So you can imagine how you had people campaigning strongly against each other and then suddenly had to work together in the White House. Well, that was what happened with Jefferson and Burr. And it wasn't just that they ran against each other and Jefferson won. They actually tied. And there was a contentious series of votes that would ultimately determine the outcome of the election. But what was more was the personalities. Jefferson was very bothered and believed that Aaron Burr was trading votes behind his back or going to the other party to seek additional votes. And that is why after so many votes that were conducted, they finally settled out that Jefferson would become president, but not before getting a big chip on his shoulder about Burr and why he didn't withdraw from the election. And so that set up Clash of Titans, so to speak, with Thomas Jefferson being this very vocal, very strong personality. And they had Aaron Burr, who was an up-and-climber in Northeast United States politics. I believe he was son of the president of Princeton. I mean, he had all the excellent, gifted lawyer. He had all the trappings of success and a meteoric rise. And so to have these two very, very powerful and very well-respected men, now they're kind of at odds together, and the relationship would only devolve from there to the point where Burr wouldn't be his vice president when Jefferson won re-election.
But they were together in the first term, right? It was Jefferson and Burr together. And can you speak to just kind of, I guess, that relationship, because, they were, to your point, they were butting heads. They ran against each other. It is interesting to kind of think of a different time in the country where they weren't even running together, right? It was literally like two separate campaigns and then they got put together. How did they coexist even before it devolved and kind of broke down? What was that like in that first term? I mean, were they, cohesive, or kind of what was the dynamic in the beginning between them other than the initial sort of conflict?
By most accounts, Burr was a good vice president. He took to the task and did the work. And you're talking about a fledgling nation, only about 5 million people. Our entire country was less than the size of modern day New York City. But he took to the work, but it never ended with Jefferson and him. That conflict was always simmering and bubbling under the surface. And later you would combine that with what would happen with Alexander Hamilton and that loss of Alexander Hamilton for that duel at Weehawken. And then what would happen is basically a giant fall from grace for Aaron Burr after that first term. And so what you found was a young man on the rise in the form of Aaron Burr butting up against Thomas Jefferson. And that would be the end of the arc, so to speak, as he would begin to trend down. But he was often a political climber, not really one of ideology, but one of increasing his political capital. And it didn't take him long after he left the White House. He tried to go to New York and reclaim his status up there. And that's when we had the Alexander Hamilton issue. And then he, in disgrace, went out west, like many men did, to go kind of make their fortune in this new territory.
Interesting. So, and that is sort of the outgrowth of that second Jefferson term, right? Because can you speak to that a little bit in terms of the transition? Let's say the winding down of the first term into the second term. What did that look like? How was Aaron Burr excised from that ticket, and who came in? Can you kind of just tell us a little bit about that in terms of how Aaron Burr left the White House? What did that look like?
So from a broad perspective, that was changed. So they're no longer going to be the same ticket, or sort of no longer be the first and second place, becoming joined after the election. George Clinton actually would become the vice president for Thomas Jefferson in the second term. And Burr went up north to try to obtain either a governorship or a high-ranking executive position up in New York. And that didn't pan out. It made famous and obviously some entertainment that's become relevant lately. And when he fell from grace at the end of this, and the combination of Jefferson, combination of that incident with Alexander Hamilton, he's just persona non grata anymore. And so a lot of people, and Jefferson, of course, feeling the power, and obviously in his second term, and you're talking about differing views on what the revolution meant. And Jefferson was of the belief that this was a burgeoning new era of freedom, democracy. It had a very, I wouldn't say flowery, but it had a very altruistic, this is a change in what freedom and liberty means. That would actually butt up a little bit against John Marshall, the then Chief Justice, view of what the revolution was. But as it pertained to Burr, it basically meant that Burr had to find a new place to reinvent himself. And you kind of see this happen throughout his life. But in this instance, we had Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s, and a lot of people were going out there to make a new name for themselves. And that's what Aaron Burr did. He went out west to try his hand doing something else. And it was that something else that landed him back in the crosshairs of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. And can we kind of dive into that a little bit? So he goes west, and the Louisiana Purchase had just happened, right? So the country had bought this wide, area of land that previously I think was owned by the French, correct? Or okay. So that purchase is made to France, and then we basically take that, and Aaron Burr goes out there. And what is he doing out there that gets him, when you say gets in the crosshairs, can you just get granular in terms of what was he doing? Because I know there was some controversy whether he I think argued that he wasn't trying to start a new nation or do anything like that. But they literally were like, no, you actually were trying to not secede, but almost make your own country, right? I mean, was that kind of the claim against him?
Yeah, so interpretations of what his actual goals were varied. Beyond the Louisiana Purchase was Mexico and obviously the Spanish Empire. So in Florida at this time was still controlled by the Spanish. And so what you were seeing was, I would say throughout history, dueling versions of what Aaron Burr was out to do. Those that floated through the trial was that he had met with individuals. He had taken the temperature of individuals in Louisiana about what they thought of Spanish rule and insurrection, and began to develop and grow an army that would later form, small amounts of it would come together, that they would get food and ships, ammunition, and find a way to pay. The idea of him raising an army. Now, the question was, what was he going to do with this? And there were some that said altruism. The more cynically minded pointed to the fact that he was going to attack and move west and possibly set up a new nation with him at the head in the center of the country. And this idea of insurrection, by the way, isn't all as wild as it might sound in today's eyes. Back then, America had barely been a country. So we're not talking about having hundreds of years of experience in the United States going from sea to shining sea. We were talking about a series of colonies that were expanding. We were talking about a Louisiana Purchase that had just happened. And we were in the process of settling the Louisiana Purchase, had just started. And so what had happened was you had this idea of, it got back to Jefferson, Burr, who was still not to be trifled with in terms of his drive, his aspirations, and his pedigree, is out in the middle of the country gathering men in arms, and he's about to go possibly attack Louisiana, maybe. He's possibly about to expand in the middle of the country. And it was that fear of, oh, wow, we could find ourselves with a rival nation right next to each other. And let's not add a little bit of Jefferson not liking Burr to begin with, that Jefferson laid out a proclamation. Anybody, he wasn't referring to Burr directly, but anybody participating in this, you're going to be in trouble, which made a little bit more recruitment difficulties for Burr, but it still didn't mean he was done. And he was doggedly pursuing after this. I think they had sent a local militia to try to disband his group, and there was conflict there. And so this was one of those things where it was evolving. Now, bear in mind, it was evolving at the speed of the 1800s. So it wasn't like, Aaron Burr tweeted out, hey, wouldn't it be great to have my own country? I mean, you're talking about people who are traveling by river. He's going down the Ohio River in his boat. I mean, so you were seeing it develop rapidly by their standards. We would call it moving at a fairly glacial pace by ours.
Yeah. And I was reading, I want to say that there were claims of talking about his army or his militia or whatever he had put together there. On the low end, they were saying, oh, no, he only had 50 to 100 people. But then I saw other claims that said, no, he had 7,000 soldiers that he had put together, which, to your point, at this time, if you have an entire population of 5 million, raising an army, if that number was indeed 7,000, that's not a small group of people that he's putting together to start kind of moving around and getting armed. The ship thing I didn't even necessarily know about, but I'm sure they were looking at this and saying, this is a potential serious problem.
And don't forget that Burr fought in the Revolutionary War and wasn't an undistinguished officer. So you've got a former commander that's now raising troops in arms. So this made Mexico so nervous. They actually stationed troops for concern of an expanding and rising United States. So this wasn't us as a country being very tame. We were young as a country, and we had plenty of mistakes still to make.
Yeah. What were the next steps? In terms of now Jefferson has put out this proclamation, right? Anybody that's rising up against or thinking of doing this, we're going to come after you, basically. Burr actually goes to trial for treason and for some other charges, which I'd love for you to speak to. What does that look like in terms of, do they arrest him? Does someone go physically bring him to DC? Does he, subpoenaed or whatever it would have been at that time and pulled into DC? What did that look like in terms of those kind of motions?
Sure. So there was a militia that was sent down to dispatch a group of people that were down in a southern island where he was supposedly growing his militia. A series of letters had actually transferred back and forth. One of them known as a cipher letter, which has its own little history as to questions of its authenticity and background. But you had a series of letters that were being exchanged that ultimately were revealed to Jefferson. So Jefferson actually goes out and proclaims before a court hears this matter, before evidence is presented, he proclaims Burr guilty of treason, just says it, and then dispatches the army to go get him. And so they send troops, they, for lack of a better phrase, arrest him, and they bring him back to Virginia to stand trial there, where he appears before a particular trial judge, but not just any trial judge. So at the time, the United States Supreme Court is fairly weak. Marbury versus Madison is a brand new concept. The idea of a powerful and independent Article 3. And when I say Article 3, we have the different articles of our U.S. Constitution. Article 1 referring to the chief executive, the president. Article 2, Congress. Article 3, the courts. And you have a very weak Article 3. Some people wondering if Article 3 should even exist or what role it should play. Yeah. And you've got a very strong historical figure in the form of John Marshall, who would be the one that would view his role as building up the strength and power of the judiciary. But he also had a different view of what the revolution was. His view of the revolution is that the next step after the revolution the revolution is about governance. policy. And no surprise that a judge is very, legalistic about this.
Mhm.
But back then, we didn't have our Supreme Court just sitting back in a nice marble building, ruling on cases as they came to them. Instead, the judges themselves actually rode circuit. They actually heard cases. It was part of their obligation to go and preside over trials.
Right.
So you have a very rare occurrence of a Chief Justice of the United States presiding over the issue of a former vice president being brought before the court for the possibility of treason.
Mhm.
And to understand just how big these personalities were that were at play during this time, you got to remember that Jefferson didn't lay back at this. Jefferson he didn't have a Justice Department. There wasn't insulation. He was an active participant in this process, even directing the litigation.
Mm.
Burr himself was an experienced and by all account, very talented lawyer who also had his own defense team. And he was no slouch in their participation. And then you had the Chief Justice of the United States, and he was obviously actively participating. And so you had what was setting the stage for a series of powerhouse players shoved into a courthouse to litigate over, one, whether Burr would be held over or he could have bail, two, whether or not charges were supported. And so the legal maneuvering was fantastic, but more importantly, it was on a scale and a class that wasn't common for the time.
Yeah, it's like an early trial of the century, right? You're in 1807. It's like as high profile as possible. I mean, are you saying in this trial that Jefferson was actively Jefferson versus Burr inside of here, or?
No, it was Hayes, but he was participating in directing legal strategy. At one point, Jefferson sent blank pardons to his prosecutor so that he could get all the testimony he wanted without anybody worrying if, I don't know, maybe they might have committed perjury. So he was not in the back. And just, the extent to which Jefferson was interested in prosecuting Burr.
Yeah.
The budget for the country at that time was $8 million. He spent $100,000 prosecuting Burr. That's 1.2% of the federal budget. If you were to do that in today's dollars, you'd be spending north of $80 billion to prosecute this conspiracy. So to say this was, when they bought the Louisiana Purchase, that was almost twice the federal budget at the time. So even though it was $15 million, and we scoff at that now, and our armed services fire off, missiles that in today's dollars are worth well more than $15 million. Back then, this was a lot of money. And so to show you the scope and the scale. And of course, you had a natural tension that was still developing between Jefferson as the chief executive and John Marshall as the head of the Article III, as they were trying to battle out who was going to have power. Was the judiciary something to be respected? Could it play an active role in interpreting law? Or was the law interpretation still to be done by the other two branches? So these concepts that we take for granted today were but babies at this time. And there's questions about whether or not they'd survive.
If Aaron Burr was ultimately acquitted of treason in this case, correct? Mm-hmm. If that had gone the other way and he was actually proven guilty and convicted, what would have been the penalty? Would it have been
dead?
Okay. So it was death penalty or treason. That was what was basically at stake here with him pretty much defending himself in this trial. You said he had the defense team, but he himself obviously was an attorney. So he's pretty much in there knowing if he loses, he's getting the death penalty.
So the game's afoot. And what's interesting, it wasn't a secret that John Marshall and Jefferson were not exactly friends in their view of the Constitution and its structure. So he did know he was going into a court that was, I wouldn't say tilted against him, but more tilted against Jefferson. And when he was brought before the court, treason was number one, and Article 2 was what's called high misdemeanor. They were bringing a violation of the Neutrality Act. Congress had passed, in short version, Congress had passed the law that basically said it was unlawful to attack any nation that we were at peace with, which seems like an odd thing to say. But then again, we were America and were rambunctious and had colonies and that have just kind of now ceded some independence to the federal government. So you never knew what could happen. So our rule was, at least the Act's rule was that you couldn't make war upon or engage in open hostilities against a country that we were at peace with. In this case, the concern was Spain, which at the time was allied with France in a war against England. So we had some vested interest in maintaining peace. And so he was brought before the court initially, at least Burr was brought before the court initially on whether or not he'd be held over, which would mean incarcerated during the pendency of the case on that treason count and on that high crime. And John Marshall basically set the tone by basically saying, I don't think you got it for treason. You might have it for a violation of the Neutrality Act. So allowed him to post bail, didn't hold him in, and he was there to be prepared his defense with his team. He prepared to respond to Jefferson's prosecutorial team in front of John Marshall, and obviously to present the matter to a jury. So detailed and so extensive was the litigation that some arguments took them, I think they were arguing over treason for something like 11 days. They were in arguments over concepts related to treason and what the definition would be, as well as something that we would see circulate and rise back up in modern times, which was to the extent to which you could subpoena presidential records, which we've seen some changes in. It's arisen back in common litigation now as some presidents have found themselves in the legal crosshairs. But at the time, you were setting the standard for some of these new issues, and John Marshall was quick to make the judiciary front and center of it, to kind of flex a little judicial power. And even if it was ignored, to show the flexing of judicial power that could be built on later.
And then how did this all sort of, kind of play out in terms of the end of it? He does get acquitted of treason. So what does the end of this trial look like? And what's sort of the aftermath for Aaron Burr and Jefferson in this case?
Sure. So he's acquitted, but interestingly, the jury doesn't come back with a not guilty. The jury drops its own custom verdict form where it says, based on the evidence presented before us, the defendant could not be proved guilty based on the evidence presented before us. I mean, a stinging rebuke from a jury saying, we don't think you're guilty. We just don't think, based on John Marshall's jury instructions, the Chief Justice's instructions of the jury, and the evidence that was presented, we can find him guilty. And so he was found not guilty of the treason. A separate trial was held later. He's found not guilty of the high misdemeanor. And the government indicated it wanted to try him again for a different set of overt acts in Ohio. And so it allowed him to post bail, but he had to report up to Ohio, where his discussion about whether or not Ohio would prosecute him for the exact same set of offenses over again, but with different overt acts. The government turned that down. And so at the end, he was free. He was not convicted, but he was not popular. And this would begin a slow decline and falling out of favor for a person who had once had a meteoric rise and been vice president and tied with Jefferson to be president. He then has to slink away and quite frankly, a degree of shame.
Can we touch a little bit on today, 2020 to 2024, right? Because what happened at January 6th, that was actually 2021, but the insurrection, we had the whole Trump versus Pence situation. Now we're not right back there, but we have a whole interesting Trump, JD Vance, president, vice president thing happening. Obviously, as like a historical precedent, Jefferson Burr is a very concrete example of a really deep conflict between a president and his former vice president, to the point where he puts him on trial for treason and literally is, the death penalty is hanging over his head. Where were we in 2021? Just to kind of touch on the, now Pence and Trump. I don't think Pence, he's been separated from Trump to a large degree in terms of saying someone from Indiana, attorney from Indiana, Pence is an Indiana, right? A political figure. Can you just kind of speak to a little bit of that now versus then, that through the lens, looking back kind of at the Jefferson Burr thing to what we recently saw there with Trump and Pence? Can you kind of just draw any parallels or just give insight into kind of where that, might have some crossover?
Well, there's some parallels, but what's important to note is the difference. Obviously, our country's evolved, it's grown, it's much larger, it has a more robust legal system. Things like the Department of Justice, which provides a degree of insulation between the president and the prosecuting arm through the Attorney General's office, exists that didn't exist back then. You've also had conflict inside the country with armed personnel, and possibly even armed conflict both inside the country as well as war against another country, because we're still growing. And so you had more of a developing young country where you had more variables, more things could occur, which means there are greater chances for people to bump into each other, and there are greater power in the chief executive. And so as these young branches of government, controlled by very small groups of people at the time, begin to grow, they begin to bump into each other, and that's where this occurs. Now, you wouldn't see the same type of circumstances that would grow out of the insurrection, for instance, versus the Burr and the Burr conspiracy to commit treason. You wouldn't see that same sort of event. What you would see, though, are some similarities, though, in personalities and how things got organized. I'm reminded of the Mark Twain quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And so one of the comments that was made by the prosecutor, actually, when they were prosecuting Burr, was that one of the issues the defense had raised was you couldn't prove his connection to the overt act. That was going to be the overt act that formed the basis for treason. But the prosecutor said, just because he wasn't there didn't mean he didn't put all of these pieces into motion. It was through Burr that he was the match. He connected all these people. He stirred up. He brought light to this issue, and he made this possible by virtue of his interconnection. He inspired these people to do this thing. Have we heard this before?
Yeah.
Saying that Donald Trump inspired people to do this insurrection. And so you saw that sort of rhyme, but from a legal prosecutorial standpoint, slightly different structures.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because it's like you almost cannot remove the person from the events, right? Like if you remove the central figure from the sequence and the chronology and everything that happens, then the question becomes, do those same events happen? And the answer is probably no, and then you start getting into, well, was anybody injured or were there any outcomes of this that were negative for so? And then it's like, well, who's liable for that? And that I think is where some of the legal stuff comes in, right? Of saying like someone actually was injured or killed or died or whatever instances. And then if you tie that back to how it kind of played out, well, where's the accountability? And that is, I think, when we talk about the justice system, right, and holding people accountable and the whole purpose of our court systems, you have to say, are we going to kind of press these buttons and use these, or are we going to not use them? And it is interesting, again, just kind of, I know it's a different, obviously the circumstances are different, but you look back 200 plus years of this Jefferson Burr thing, they pulled him in, they said, no, you are doing something. We're not going to pretend like nothing is happening here when, to your point of the jury, right? The jury saying, we don't necessarily think you're not guilty. We just think that it wasn't, perfectly proven here.
I tell you what echoes most with me as a former deputy prosecutor and defense attorney is how do you prove it? And I think that's where the question comes in. Everybody has this sense of what happened, but how do you prove it in a court of law? And I think of what echoed in this case, what you hear, or what occurred in this case, what you hear echoes of later in history is Burr's legal team asked John Marshall, the judge, at one point that they wanted to issue a subpoena to the president for some letters and records that he had. Because Burr the whole world had heard Thomas Jefferson declare that Burr had committed treason. And it basically came out with it. Well, as they would argue in court, if he's going to, pronounce that I had committed this crime so clearly and that, Burr is clearly guilty of committing this offense, he certainly must have letters and records and documents. And so for days, they argued about whether or not you could force a president to respond to a subpoena from the courts and cough up these records. Ultimately, John Marshall said it's not the person that controls the records, it's the character of the records themselves, and ordered Jefferson to turn them over. Do you know what Jefferson did?
No, what did he do?
He ignored it. And do you know what John Marshall did? He ignored the ignoring of it. Because the idea was he had established this precedent now that the court could order the executive to do it, even though the executive never complied. And then you would later see these arguments echo in the Clinton sexual harassment case, where Clinton would make these exact same arguments as to why he didn't need to turn over records and information. And so you see this cases develop over history, culminating in what we would see now with a presidential immunity case with one of the cases with President Trump, or former President Trump. But you saw the seeds of these cases when it came to the extent to which presidents in and of themselves had authority to decline or must comply, seeded all the way back in early 1800s.
Yeah, it's interesting. It goes back to that whole tidewater, the idea that you mentioned in the beginning of that small population of 5 million people and almost this like elite class, which again is kind of like the tidewater thing. And anyone can have their own opinion. I think for me, regardless of what side of the political aisle you are or who's in office, right? It doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican. You still have the rule of law. And I do think the idea of someone being, able to skirt that or whatever is not, it's interesting that precedent was set so long ago and you're still seeing echoes of it now. And to your point, 30 years ago, the Clinton thing, it's like, we've seen it time and time again. And it's like, do we want that or is that not acceptable for us? It's an interesting question. Bradley, thank you so much today for joining us here on Unshut Cases. This has been a real eye opener. We hope to have you back soon. Can you tell the audience where they can find you and the firm?
Sure, absolutely. We're in Indiana, particularly in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we can be reached at www.indjustice.com.
Awesome. Well, again, we hope to have you back here soon, Brad. And thank you so much for lightening us all here on Unshut Cases today.
Thank you for having me.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for part 2, which is coming out soon. Brad, again, thanks for being on the podcast. Audience, like and subscribe, please, and check us out for part 2.